An Introduction to Pierre Bourdieu's Key Theoretical Concepts by Elaine M. Power. At the heart of Pierre Bourdieu's sociological studies is an integrated theoretical framework of relevance to sociologists of food and nutrition. One of Bourdieu's primary concerns is to overcome dichotomies in social theory, such as micro macro, material symbolic, empirical theoretical, objective subjective, public private, structure agency. His other sociologic concerns are to understand the practical logic of everyday life, to understand relations of power, and to develop a reflexive sociology. The primary objective of this paper is to introduce Bourdieu's key theoretical concepts, habitus, practice, field, and different forms of capital, such as cultural, economic, social, and symbolic. While gender, class, ethnicity, culture, education, and the historical time period all shape an individual's habitus, practice, what one does in everyday life, is dynamic and fluid, like a jazz musician's improvisation on a theme. Practice is the result of the relationship between an individual's habitus, different forms of capital, and the field of action. I give an example of how Bourdieu's theoretical framework might be used to understand how single mothers on welfare feed their families in a small town, and suggest other areas in the sociology of food and nutrition to which it might usefully be applied. Introduction. Pierre Bourdieu is perhaps best known among sociologists of food and nutrition for his comprehensive ethnography of French culture, Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste. In Distinction, 1984, Bourdieu analyzes the ways in which taste is formed and reproduced in relation to the class structure of contemporary France. However, Distinction is just one piece of Bourdieu's broader sociological project, a project of particular relevance to the sociology of food and nutrition. Underlying Bourdieu's studies of French society is an integrated theoretical and methodological approach that seeks to overcome sociological dichotomies, including micro macro, subjective objective, material symbolic, structure agency, empirical theoretical, public private, and freedom necessity. Such an approach to sociological studies of food, which involve the material and the symbolic, the public and the private, encompass issues from micro to macro levels of analysis and invoke representative sociological dilemmas and dichotomies, could be particularly fruitful, so to speak. Bourdieu's other sociological concerns are to understand the practical logic of everyday life and social action, to understand relations of power and domination, and to develop a reflexive sociology. By using Bourdieu's theoretical perspective to explore food related issues, sociologists of food and nutrition could help fulfill Mackintosh's promise that the sociology of food and nutrition will contribute to the growth of sociological theory. The main theoretical tools Bourdieu uses to explore his themes are habitus, practice, field, and different forms of capital, such as cultural, economic, social, and symbolic. The purpose of this paper is to introduce these concepts and then to show how they might be used in a study of how single mothers on social assistance feed their families in a small town. It is important to understand these theoretical concepts in order to appreciate Bourdieu's stance on the broad sociological concerns outlined in the previous paragraph. Habitus. The concept of habitus is central to Bourdieu's theoretical framework. It is his way of explaining the regularities of behavior that are associated with social structures, such as class, gender, and ethnicity, without making social structures deterministic of behavior or losing sight of the individual's own agency. Habitus is a way of describing the embodiment of social structures and history in individuals. It is a set of dispositions, internal to the individual, that both reflects external social structures and shapes how the individual perceives the world and acts in it. Although the social structures embodied in habitus do not determine behavior, the individual is predisposed to act in accordance with the social structures that have shaped her, because, in effect, she carries those social structures with her. In Bourdieu's words, the conditionings associated with a particular class of conditions of existence produce habitus, systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. That is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an express mastery of the operations necessary in order to attain them. The individual's primary habitus, inculcated in childhood, tends to be more durable than the one or more secondary habitus that may be learned later, as one takes on a profession or trade. The dispositions acquired in childhood literally mold the body and become second nature, operating in a way that is preconscious and hence not readily amenable to conscious reflection and modification. For example, gender identity is an aspect of the habitus that is inculcated practically from the moment of birth. Gender identity is a deeply rooted, bodily anchored dimension of an agent's habitus. It affects the individual in the most natural parts of his or her identity, as it concerns his or her body, the vision of the body, the possibilities of sensual perception, of feeling and expressing pleasure and pain. Relearning another gender identity appears to be almost impossible. The dispositions that constitute the habitus are also structured, inevitably affecting the social conditions in which they were formed. For example, the habitus of an individual who grew up in a working class family will tend to be similar to the habitus of others in a similar geographical region from working class families, and differ, at least in some aspects, from those of middle class backgrounds. Like gender, the class disposition of the primary habitus is very durable. Even if an individual moves away from the class background of her childhood, subtle aspects of her accent, mannerisms, and bodily comportment may betray her origins. Habitus is not only the product of structures and producer of practices, but it is also the reproducer of structures. The habitus tends to generate practices that coincide with the social conditions that produced it, and continuing to act in accordance with the structures that have helped to create their habitus, people reproduce those structures, though potentially with modifications. Habitus shapes and produces practice, but does not determine it. The flexibility of practice, regulated by habitus, has been compared to the musical practice of jazz musicians. Jazz musicians stay within certain musical boundaries, follow a particular jazz tradition or style, and are limited by the physical constraints of their instrument. But they may improvise almost endlessly on a musical theme, elaborating different versions that are barely recognizable. Waquant quotes Bourdieu: habitus is in cahoots with the fuzzy and the vague. As a generative spontaneity which asserts itself in the improvised confrontation with endlessly renewed situations, it follows a practical logic, that of the fuzzy, of the more or less, which defines the ordinary relation to the world. Consequently, we should refrain from searching the productions of habitus for more logic than they actually contain. The logic of practice is logical up to the point where to be logical would cease being practical. The peculiar difficulty of sociology, then, is to produce a precise science of an imprecise, fuzzy, woolly reality. Practice. The concept of habitus is Bourdieu's way of overcoming the subjective objective dichotomy, as well as other related dichotomies, such as structure, agency, and freedom, necessity. Although habitus has a large role in what people do in their everyday lives or their practice, practice involves more than habitus. Bourdieu's model of practice conceptualizes action as the outcome of a relationship between habitus, capital, and field. Practices are not to be reduced to either habitus or field, but grow out of the interrelationship established at each point in time by the sets of relations represented by both. Fields are structured spaces organized around particular types of capital, consisting of dominant and subordinate positions. Examples of fields that Bourdieu has analyzed include the field of law, the field of art, the field of education, the intellectual field, the field of science, and the field of religion. Fields donate arenas of production, circulation, and appropriation of goods, services, knowledge, or status, and the competitive positions held by actors in their struggle to accumulate and monopolize these different kinds of capital. Fields cannot exist without capital. As Swartz point out, there are as many different types of fields as there are forms of capital. Bourdieu identifies four main types of capital: economic, cultural, social, and symbolic. Economic capital is the most straightforward type of capital, and a type which we are accustomed to associating with power, money, and wealth. Cultural capital exists in three forms: in the embodied state, i.e., in the form of long lasting dispositions of the mind and body; in the objectified state, in the form of cultural goods, pictures, books, dictionaries, instruments, machines, etc., and in the institutionalized state, a form of objectification resulting in such things as educational qualifications. Social capital accrues from networks of relationships, especially institutionalized relationships such as the family. Symbolic capital is the form that the other types of capital assume when the arbitrariness of their nature is misrecognized. For example, the legitimate form of the family, father, mother, and children, has symbolic capital out of proportion with its social or economic capital. One of the features of different types of capital is that they are interconvertible, though Bourdieu recognizes that it is economic capital which is most easily converted into the other forms, e.g., money buys education and influence, and is the most straightforward to accumulate and transmit to other generations through family relations. Not surprisingly, capital is also central to Bourdieu's understanding of class. For Bourdieu, it is the total volume of capital and the composition of capital, as well as the social trajectory, upward, downward, or stable social mobility, which defines the three-dimensional space called class. Using Bourdieu's theoretical framework. One of the key theoretical premises of my proposed study of how single mothers on social assistance feed their families in a small town is that single mothers on social assistance share common values, needs, and desires with other members of Canadian society. They are not members of a deviant subculture or underclass with particular values and practices that separate them from everyone else. A second fundamental premise is that food sits at the intersection of the biological or material and the symbolic aspects of human life. Food is essential for life because we need its energy and nutrients as biological creatures. But the nature of our humanity lies in our social practices, and thus our ability to sustain ourselves involves more than nutrients. What we eat is a sign of membership, social status, and spiritual worth. Eating the same food as others is a basic mark of belonging. I am interested in understanding the logic of the practice of feeding a family under economic and social constraints, and to show that the logic of the practice has its own rationality. This rationality is derived from the interaction of habitus and field, and the use and accumulation of various types of capital. It is not necessarily rational, as understood by rationalist social theories, such as rational action theory. The logic of the practice of feeding a family involves fulfilling not just the material, but also the symbolic aspects of the physical need for food. The practice of feeding the family involves, in part, meeting what Stone calls communal needs, which include community, solidarity, a sense of belonging, dignity, respect, self-esteem and honor, friendship, and love. Bourdieu's model of practice suggests a three-step approach to any sociological study: analysis of A, the particular field in relation to the broader field of power; B, the structure of objective relations between the different positions within the field; and C, the habitus, notably the class habitus agents bring to their positions in the field and the social trajectory of those positions. Bourdieu has only recently turned to the family as a field of study. The family plays a key role in the maintenance of the social order and is a primary site of the accumulation and transmission of different forms of capital. One of the main focuses of this study will be to describe the different forms of capital single mothers on welfare have and how they use, accumulate, and are denied capital. The families in this study are a particular type of family, mother led families living on social assistance. As single parent families, they disrupt the socially sanctioned form of the family as father, mother, and children. This diminishes their symbolic capital significantly. In fact, attributes negative symbolic capital, or stigma, to them. They are also stigmatized by their perceived violation of the work ethic because of their use of welfare to support themselves and their families. Single mothers on welfare have come to symbolize the anxieties of a society in which traditional assumptions about the work family welfare nexus are unraveling. Class, gender, culture, and the organization of the economy, i.e., a capitalistic market economy, shapes the food habitus of the single mothers on welfare in this study and will be reflected in their food preferences. Their notions of the appropriateness of various foods and combinations of foods for different times of the day and week, different groups of people, especially men and children, and different occasions throughout the year, and their skill in creating meals for their families. The practice of feeding the family involves the food habitus of the mothers, but also the various forms of capital they have at their disposal to use or spend. The different types of capital which they are seeking to enhance or accumulate for themselves or their children, as well as the various fields in which they must interact and the other agents in those fields. So, for example, the mundane and apparently simple chore of packing a child's lunch for school reflects a complex interaction among habitus, capitals, and fields, the rules and profits of which are mostly intuitively known without conscious reflection. What gets packed in the lunchbox depends on the mother's notion of a culturally appropriate and healthy lunch for her child, the child's preferences, what is available in the house at the time, or the ability to buy more groceries to supplement what is in the house, and the school community standards for an appropriate lunch, all of which are constructed by similar social structures and forces in a small town and will therefore tend to be mutually reinforcing. A single mother in welfare may buy single portion packaging, brand names, or types of food that are more expensive to ensure that her child's lunch fits the norm for his or her classroom, violating strictly economic logic. By spending more on groceries to ensure the symbolic capital of her child's lunch, she will have to scrimp in the limited areas of the family's expenditures where further reductions are possible, such as her own food intake, potentially compromising her health, bodily capital. But by making sacrifices in other areas of the family's expenditures to promote the symbolic capital of her child's lunch, the single mother on welfare will be preserving the child's social capital by preventing him or her from being ostracized from his or her peer group and supporting the child's accumulation of cultural capital by making school attendance easier. This one example illustrates how using Bourdieu's theoretical framework can help point to the logic of a practice, logic, which may not otherwise be readily apparent. I anticipate that a Bordelian theoretical orientation will help me understand how the dynamics of a small town affect the struggles of single mothers on welfare to feed their families. I am particularly interested in the impact of stigmatization in a place where it is difficult to hide one's status as a single mother on welfare and the role and impact of family and friends, social capital, in the process of feeding the family. I will also be examining the impact of the mother's habitus on their practices of feeding the family and their efforts to shape the habitus and capital accumulation of their children. Conclusion. I have presented a brief introduction to Bourdieu's sociological concerns and his key theoretical concepts, and one example of how Bourdieu's theoretical framework might be used in understanding the practice of feeding the family. I hope this introduction gives a flavor of the richness, depth, and complexity of his work. While Bourdieu's conceptual framework may have to be extended in some directions, it holds potential for application to many other areas of interest to sociologists of food and nutrition, including studies of the body, social stratification, agricultural systems, eating behaviors and food practices, nutrition professions, and food industry. I believe that a thoughtful, critical engagement with his theoretical and methodological perspective has much to offer the emerging field of the sociology of food and nutrition, including ways of thinking, questioning, and researching that are empirically grounded and informed by rigorous social theory.